Picture this. A woman lies on a cot in a mud-walled room in northern India. Her legs have not moved in 11 years. Missionaries have prayed over her. Doctors have shaken their heads and walked away. Her family has accepted the verdict. But a young man kneels beside her, and he is not accepting anything. He takes her hands. He closes his eyes. And in a voice so quiet the room has to lean in to hear it, he says, "Rise, sister. Jesus heals you now." Nothing happens. He does not move. He does not open his eyes. He stays there, on his knees, hands wrapped around hers, for what feels like 10 minutes. The room grows uncomfortable. Someone near the door shifts his weight. Someone else clears his throat. Then her toes move. Then her feet. Then she is sitting up, weeping, grabbing the edge of the cot, standing for the first time in 11 years, while the room collapses into prayer and shouting, and a sound that no one in that village would forget for the rest of their lives. His name was Arjun Nath Patel. And if you have never heard that name, that is not an accident. He never wanted you to. But by the time you finish hearing his story, you will understand why the greatest force God ever released into northern India wore sandals, carried nothing, ate almost nothing, and died at 44 years old in a room barely large enough to lie down in. How does a boy from a high-caste Brahmin family, trained from birth to recite Sanskrit prayers to gods of stone, end up kneeling in the dirt beside a dying woman and watching her stand up? How does a young man who once burned a Bible in his courtyard become the man who carried that same message into places so dangerous that British missionaries refused to go? How do you go from everything, wealth, family, status, a future already mapped out for you, to nothing? And why would anyone choose that? This is his story, and by the end you will not be able to shake it. Arjun Nath Patel was born in 1880 in the city of Amritsar, in what was then the Punjab region of British India. His father was a man of position, educated, prosperous, connected to both the old world of Hindu tradition and the new world of British colonial commerce. The Patel household had servants. It had a courtyard. It had a name that meant something in the neighborhood. Arjun was the second of 4 sons, and from the moment he could sit still long enough to be taught, his father made sure he knew exactly who he was and what was expected of him. He studied Sanskrit. He memorized the Vedas. He learned to perform the rituals correctly, precisely with the kind of seriousness that made his father proud. Religion in the Patel home was not a private feeling. It was a public identity, a social contract, a matter of family honor. To be a Brahmin was to be a certain kind of person, and Arjun, bright, intense, hungry for meaning, threw himself into it completely. But hunger is a dangerous thing when the food stops satisfying. By the time Arjun was 15, something was wrong inside him that he could not name. He performed the rituals. He said the prayers. He watched the smoke rise from the offerings and waited to feel something, anything. The presence of a god, a response, a whisper from the other side of the universe. Nothing came. The silence was not peaceful. It was hollow. He began asking questions his father did not want to hear. What is the point of a prayer that nobody answers? How do you know the gods are real and not simply stories we tell ourselves to feel less alone in the dark? His father shut these questions down with the authority of a man who had never allowed himself to ask them. Stop this thinking. It is not your place to question what has always been. Study harder. Pray more carefully. Arjun studied harder. He prayed more carefully. The hollow only deepened. Then one afternoon, when he was 16, a friend dared him the way boys dare each other, casually, as though it means nothing, to attend a meeting at a small building on the edge of the market district. Christian missionaries from England had recently arrived. They were talking about a man named Jesus. The meeting was poorly attended, slightly embarrassing, and, his friend said, good for a laugh. Arjun went to mock. He sat in the back row with his arms crossed. The missionary was a thin, pale man who spoke Punjabi with an accent that should have been easier to dismiss than it was. He talked about a God who came down, who walked among the poor, who touched lepers, who ate with people that no one else would eat with, who died and then was not dead anymore. Arjun left disgusted, but he could not stop thinking. Over the next several weeks, something happened that he later described as a war inside his chest that he had not started and could not finish. He went back to the meetings. He went back 3 times, in secret, telling his family he was visiting a classmate. He borrowed a Bible. He read the Gospel of John in the back corner of his room with a small oil lamp, reading slowly because his English was not yet strong, running his finger under every sentence. When he reached the 11th chapter, Lazarus, 4 days dead, and Jesus standing outside the tomb saying, "I am the resurrection and the life," Arjun put the book down, put his face in his hands, and wept for reasons he could not have explained to anyone. He was 17 years old. He had never wept like that before. He did not become a Christian that night. What happened was quieter and more disorienting than a conversion. It was more like a door opening in a house he thought he already knew, and finding a room on the other side that had always been there. He told no one. He went on performing the family rituals. He went on studying, but he started reading that Bible every night, working through it slowly, asking questions on the pages in pencil, arguing with it, pushing back against it, finding to his fury that it kept pushing back harder. The crisis came on a Thursday in November of 1898. His father had arranged his engagement. The girl was from a good family. The match was appropriate. There was to be a dinner, a celebration, a future that was already decided. And that night, sitting in the courtyard while the household around him prepared for a future he did not want, Arjun made a decision that he knew would cost him everything. He found the Bible he had borrowed and brought it to his father. He said, "I believe this is true." What happened next in that courtyard? The shouting, the grief, the rage, his mother's weeping, his father's face. He never described in detail in any of his later writings. Only once, speaking to a small group of young men near the end of his life, did he say this: "My father loved me, that is what made it so hard." A man who does not love you can dismiss you. A man who loves you and cannot accept what you have become, that is a different kind of pain altogether. He was thrown out of the house that night. He was 18 years old. He had no money, no plan, no community, and no place to sleep. He showed up at the missionary's door at 10 o'clock at night, rain-soaked, carrying nothing. The missionary, whose name was Thomas Griffiths, opened the door, looked at him for a moment and said, "Come in. I'll make tea." That night began 6 years of formation that Arjun later called the years of being hammered. He was baptized. He began studying in earnest. Theology, language, scripture, church history. He was a ferocious student, the kind who does not sleep because there are still pages to read. Griffiths later wrote in a letter back to England that Arjun possessed an intellectual appetite that bordered on alarming and a prayer life that put most ordained ministers to shame. The prayer life was the thing. This is the part that people who heard Arjun Nath Patel's name later in life, the people who came to the healing meetings, who watched the wheelchairs empty, who saw what he did in those remote villages, this is the part they never knew about. What happened in the dark, before any of them arrived? Arjun did not treat prayer as a discipline. He treated it as the only thing standing between him and complete helplessness. From those early years in Griffith's home, he developed the habit of rising at 4 in the morning and spending the first 3 hours of every day on his knees before doing anything else. Not reading, not preparing sermons, praying, listening, wrestling. He wrote in his journal in 1903, "I am afraid of the day I stop being desperate. A man who prays without desperation is performing. A man who prays from desperation is actually talking to someone." He fasted every Wednesday. Not symbolically, full fasts, no food, nothing but water from sundown Tuesday to sundown Wednesday every single week for more than 20 years. No one asked him to do this. No teacher required it. He simply decided that if he was going to go into places and ask God to do impossible things, he had better spend a great deal of time in the presence of the God he was asking. In 1904, at age 24, Arjun left the relative safety of the mission compound and walked north. Not metaphorically. He physically walked north, into the foothills of the Himalayas, into regions where there were no churches, no missionaries, no infrastructure, and where the name of Jesus had genuinely never been heard. He wore simple clothing. He carried his Bible and a small blanket. He ate what was offered. He slept where he was allowed to sleep, which was sometimes indoors and sometimes not. He did this because he believed that is what the first disciples did, and he saw no reason why it should work differently now. The first 3 years were brutal. He was turned away from villages. He was mocked by priests, who considered him a traitor to his caste and a fool for his beliefs. He was physically beaten twice. Once by a group of young men who threw rocks at him until he ran, and once by the servants of a local landowner who objected to someone from his tradition speaking about Christ in the area. He contracted dysentery so severely in the winter of 1906 that a British doctor who passed through the region later said he could not explain why Arjun was still alive. He kept going. This is the part that is difficult to communicate without it sounding like a formula, a Hollywood script, a story shaped too neatly for the truth it is trying to contain. But the people who traveled with Arjun during these years, a rotating group of young Indian Christian men who would accompany him for months at a time and then return to their homes, changed. These people were unanimous in what they reported. He was not discouraged, not in the way you would expect. He was tired, yes. He was hungry, often. He was honest about the difficulty. But the discouragement that should have crushed him, the kind that comes from years of effort producing almost nothing visible, never seemed to land where it should have. A companion named Reuben, who walked with Arjun for 3 months in 1907, wrote years later, "I asked him once how he kept going after so many villages turned him away. He looked at me with that expression he had, like the question itself was slightly baffling to him. He said, 'What would I do instead? Go back?' Go back to what?" The healings began quietly. The first documented account is from 1905, a village called Nurpur, in the hills east of the Kangra Valley. A child had been ill for weeks, high fever, unresponsive, the family already beginning to grieve. Arjun was passing through, was asked to pray by a woman who had heard he was a man of prayer regardless of what he believed, and he sat beside the child for 2 hours. He did not shout, he did not make a spectacle, he simply prayed, quietly, hands on the child's forehead, until something in the room changed in a way that the family later could not describe except to say that the air became different. The child's fever broke that night. By morning she was sitting up asking for food. Word moved the way. Word moves in a place where there is no other form of communication, person to person, village to village, slowly and then all at once. By 1908, Arjun was not walking into empty villages anymore. He was walking into villages that had sent someone 3 days' journey to find him and ask him to come. He always came, never charged anything. He never asked for anything. He ate what was offered and refused anything that seemed excessive. He prayed for the sick whether they were interested in Christianity or not. When asked why, he said something that people repeated for decades afterward. Jesus did not ask the 10 lepers for a statement of faith before he healed them. He healed them. The response was their business. By 1912, Arjun Nath Patel was a figure that the British colonial administration had begun to notice. Not because he was causing trouble, but because the regions he moved through were experiencing something that no administrator had a category for. Social structures were shifting. Caste barriers that had been immovable for generations were softening in the communities he visited, not because he preached about them directly, but because his presence, a high-caste man who ate with untouchables, who prayed for the sick regardless of their station, who clearly considered the woman on the lowest rung of every social ladder to be worth exactly the same attention as the man at the top, made the old hierarchies suddenly look like a choice rather than a law. A British district commissioner wrote in a report in 1913, "This individual, Patel, is not a political agitator in any ordinary sense. He does not speak of politics at all. And yet wherever he goes, people begin behaving differently toward each other, and this is proving more disruptive to the established order than any agitator I have encountered." He meant it as a concern. History reads it differently. In 1914, the opposition intensified. A coalition of local religious leaders formally protested Arjun's presence in the region, accusing him of sorcery, of using tricks to deceive the vulnerable, of being a tool of the British colonial project to undermine Indian religion and identity. The accusations were taken up by a regional newspaper in Lahore, which ran a series of articles portraying him as a fraud, a charlatan, a high-caste apostate who had sold his soul to foreign missionaries. The articles were widely read. The damage was real. Several villages that had welcomed him closed their doors. Families who had been quietly moving toward faith pulled back. A young man who had been traveling with him for a year returned to his home under family pressure. It was, by any visible measure, the most damaging period of Arjun's public life. and he responded in a way that no one expected. He wrote a public letter addressed to the editor of the newspaper and to the religious leaders who had made the accusations. It was not defensive. It was not angry. It was, by all accounts, one of the most unusual documents produced in that region in that era. He acknowledged every accusation point by point. He admitted that he could not prove, by the standards of formal evidence, that any miracle had taken place under his hands. He said that he was not asking anyone to believe in him. He said that he had made mistakes, that his methods had sometimes been abrupt, that he had not always been as patient with community leaders as he should have been, that there were healing meetings he could point to where nothing had happened, and he had no explanation for why. And then he said, "If every accusation in these articles is true, then I am a fool and a fraud, and you are right to warn people against me. But I have knelt beside dying children and watched them live. I have held the hands of men the doctors abandoned and seen them rise. I cannot unknow what I have seen. You may call it what you wish. I will continue doing what I have been doing, because I have no other explanation for what I have witnessed than the one I already have." He kept going. By 1918, the healing meetings had grown beyond anything that could be managed quietly. In the town of Dharamsala, a crowd of over 3,000 gathered over 2 days to see him pray for the sick. The stories that emerged from those 2 days, documented in letters, in missionary reports, in the testimony of a physician named Dr. Charles Ashworth, who attended out of professional skepticism and left unable to write a satisfactory clinical explanation for 3 of the cases he personally observed, circulated through the regional church network for years. Ashworth later wrote in a private letter to a colleague in Edinburgh, "I went prepared to debunk. I came away confused. I cannot tell you what I saw was miraculous, because I do not know what that word means in precise enough terms to use it in correspondence with you. What I can tell you is that I saw things I cannot explain, and that the man responsible for them is either the most extraordinary self-deceiver I have ever encountered, or something else entirely." Inside the meetings themselves, Arjun's method was nothing like the dramatic platform performances that would later become associated with healing evangelism in the West. He did not shout for most of it. He did not perform. He moved through the crowd slowly, stopping beside each person, kneeling if he needed to kneel, taking hands, praying quietly, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 20. When nothing happened, he did not pretend that it had. When something happened, he stepped back and let the crowd draw its own conclusions. He was once asked by a young Indian pastor why he never made more of the miracles, why he didn't announce them, build on them, create momentum from them. Arjun looked at the young man and said, "The moment I start needing the miracles to happen for my sake, they will stop happening. They are not for me." The opposition never stopped. It simply changed shape. In 1920, a formal complaint was lodged with the British administration accusing Arjun of practicing medicine without a license, based on testimony from 3 families who claimed that sick members had died after being told by Arjun to discontinue medical treatment. The charge was serious. It was also, in 2 of the 3 cases, demonstrably false. The family members in question had died weeks before Arjun had any contact with them. The 3rd case was more complicated, and Arjun never denied that the situation had been mishandled. The investigation lasted 8 months. It was dismissed, but the 8 months had taken something from him. He was thinner when it was over. He moved differently. The companions who traveled with him during those years noted that he prayed longer, not shorter, during the investigation, that if anything, the external pressure seemed to drive him further inward, further into the place he had always described as the only ground he was sure of. He was 40 years old. He had 4 years left. He spent them, as he had spent all the others, walking, praying, kneeling beside the sick, eating whatever was offered and refusing the rest, rising at 4 in the morning in whatever room or hut or field he happened to be sleeping in, and spending those first hours in a silence that the people who witnessed it said was not empty but full of something that pressed against the walls. His body began failing in 1923. The years of exposure, of inadequate food, of illnesses pushed through without rest, of a physical life that had never made concessions to comfort. The body had accounts to settle, and it began settling them. He developed a persistent cough that companions recognized as serious long before he acknowledged it. He lost weight he could not afford to lose. His hands, which had always been the instrument of so much of what people came to see, those hands that had rested on 10,000 heads and held 10,000 desperate faces, those hands began to tremble. He refused to stop. He was in a village called Palampur, in the Kangra Valley, in January of 1924, when he collapsed during a prayer meeting. They carried him to a room in the home of a local believer, a small room with a low ceiling and a window that looked out toward the mountains, and he lay there for 9 days. A doctor came. There was not much to be done. He was lucid for most of those 9 days. He prayed when he had breath for it. He spoke to the people who came to sit with him. Young men he had mentored, local pastors he had helped establish, ordinary villagers who had walked half a day to be there. He was not mournful. He was not afraid. Those who sat with him described the same quality in those last days that they had always described in his presence during his ministry. A sense that the room itself was different, that the air was full of something that you could not name but also could not deny. On the morning of February 3rd, 1924, Arjun Nath Patel died. He was 44 years old. He had no money, no property, no institution bearing his name. He had never sought recognition from any denomination. He had never courted the approval of the British missionary establishment. He had walked into more villages than anyone ever counted, prayed for more sick people than any record captured, and trained by quiet example rather than formal program a generation of Indian Christian leaders who would carry what they had seen him do into the next 50 years of the country's history. India would gain its independence 23 years after his death. The church that had grown in the regions where he walked, slow, stubborn, deep-rooted, suspicious of showmanship in the way that things grown in hard soil tend to be suspicious of easy shortcuts. That church would survive a partition, survive persecution, survive decades of pressure that destroyed more visible and better resourced institutions. His journals were not published until 1947. When they finally were, a bishop in Calcutta who read them said something that was passed around among Indian Christian leaders for years afterward. This man understood something about prayer that most of us have spent our entire ministries avoiding. What did he understand? He understood that you cannot separate what happens in the public meeting from what happens in the secret place before anyone arrives. He understood that the miracles, if they were real, and he never stopped believing that they were, did not originate with him. He was a vessel, not a source, a pipe, not a well, and a pipe that is not connected to the water does not flow, regardless of how impressive it looks. He wrote this in his journal in 1919, 4 years before he died. I am nothing. I have always been nothing. God has occasionally chosen to use my nothing as a container for his something. I do not take credit for the container. I did not make myself, but I chose every morning to bring the empty container back and put it in front of him again. That is the only thing I have ever done that was truly mine. Now here is the question that Arjun Nath Patel's life puts to everyone who hears it. You do not have to be walking into remote Himalayan villages. You do not have to be sleeping on mud floors and fasting every Wednesday. But the principle does not change with the geography. The secret place precedes the public miracle. What happens at 4 in the morning shapes what happens at 4 in the afternoon. The depth of the root determines the height of the tree. Are you willing to be nothing so that God can use your nothing for something? Are you willing to rise before the world demands your attention and spend that first hour, that first half hour, that first 20 minutes, in a place where no one is watching and nothing feels impressive, pressing into the presence of the one who is actually the source? Arjun Patel gave 44 years to that question. He gave it everything. He left no money, no buildings, no legacy by the world's accounting. He left behind a generation of people who had watched a man pray until heaven moved and could never again convince themselves that prayer was merely ceremony. If you are ready to stop treating prayer as a last resort and start treating it as a first one, leave a comment below. I will press in. And tell us, who do you want us to cover next? Because Arjun Nath Patel was not the only one who walked this road. There are others whose names you have never heard, whose stories are buried in languages you don't speak, and archives no algorithm will ever surface. Men and women who gave everything and left nothing behind except the changed lives of people who watched them do it. Don't forget to subscribe to Host of Witnesses and hit that notification bell. Because next time we are going into the mountains of China. A woman with no formal education, a temper she spent 30 years learning to surrender, and a stubbornness that the Communist Party of China eventually decided was more trouble to fight than to simply outlast. And they were wrong. Watch what happens when the last thing standing in the path of an empire is a woman who has already decided she has nothing left to lose.